Hey listeners, welcome back. We're jumping into part 2 of our History of the Christian Right in the podcast series here. As a reminder, this was originally released in 2016 in the run-up to the elections at that time. As a result, please disregard any references to web content, things like that, which are dated inside these episodes. If you've not signed up for the newsletter yet at theendofhistory.net, please head to the website there, again, theendofhistory.net. Sign up today. All new subscribers will be sent a free ebook of my personal application and study guide that supplements the new book, Politically Incorrect, Real Faith in an Era of Unreal Politics. If you're not quite sure if you're signed up for the newsletter or not, I sent an email blast out about this series yesterday. If you didn't get it, you're not subscribed, so that's how you know. Enjoy this episode. Parts 3 and 4 will drop next week.
This is the end of history.
True revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies.
We believe that peace is at hand.
An axis of evil arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Democracy and freedom for all. We must choose in this crucial moment of human history.
Welcome back to the End of History, continuing our story today on the history of the religious right. This is episode 2 in that series. Moving on from there, it's important to keep in mind that the shifts that brought about the modern religious right movement, they weren't sudden, even if they felt that way sometimes. They're bursting onto the scene beginning in the 1980s, their zenith of power in the 2000s. Those were public, those were loud, but there was a lot of quiet shifting that took place long before all of that. For example, the early Christian political and social policy leaders, they would have fit more along the lines of Democrats and liberals. Consider two of the main ones that we looked at in the first episode, the last episode here at the End of History. William Jennings Bryan, he was a Democrat, a presidential contender several times. Jane Addams, she was a co-founder of the ACLU. When did that change? Why? Why did it change? How did it change? So these days, no matter how honorable Christian, no matter how Christian and humanitarian their ideals might be, those two guys, and many like them during that time period, they wouldn't be welcomed in the Republican Party, and they wouldn't fit in with the modern Christian right as we know it. So that's kind of a big deal, and that's ultimately one of the big problems of the Christian right, in my perspective. Things get so codified, so politicized, that it was difficult to find those who wanted to do the will of God, who were fired up for helping the prisoners, helping the hungry, helping the poor, the weak, the lost, and dying, because they didn't have the right party affiliations. So how did we get here? When did the politically active Christians move from being more closely associated with Republicans than with Democrats? That's what we're going to look at in the episode today, or that's at least what we're going to start looking at, and it will really converge over into the episode 3 in this series. But it started just before World War II, and it really solidified afterwards, after that war. Two key things were triggers. The first was the significant threat of communism during and after the Great Depression. And the second was the new standing or superpower status that the U.S. found itself in after World War II. Tom Brokaw, and I think I've referenced this in previous series and podcasts here at the End of History, but he wrote a book years ago called The Greatest Generation. And it captured the idea of this generation who endured the Great Depression. They fought and won World War II, then lifted America to superpower status. And when you think about all they saw, all that generation, the guys and the ladies and the men in that generation that they saw, it's difficult to argue with the premise that Tom Brokaw presented in the book that this truly was the greatest American generation that ever existed. I mean, they came from some really bad circumstances, and they accomplished a whole lot in the course of their lifetime. So it's easy to miss how desperate their situation was in the 1930s at the height of the Great Depression. The U.S. gross national product of the country, it didn't reach its pre-depression status for more than a decade as the economy rolled and tumbled along. during that time period. Unemployment topped out in 1933 during the Great Depression at 25% nationally. Think about that. 1 in 4 people were without a job throughout the country. And in some specific locations, it was even worse than that. In Toledo, Ohio, unemployment was at 80% during the Great Depression. Lowell, Massachusetts was at 90%. This was the day of the food lines. It was the day when people would do anything to get a job and be able to take care of their family. Franklin Roosevelt came to the presidency with an aim to fix all that. The former president, Herbert Hoover, he had determined to just wait it out. Once the stock market crashed, President Hoover, he just decided we're going to wait this thing out. There had been depressions in the U.S. before. A lot of people don't recognize that reality, but there had been major, even worse depressions, economic depressions in the United States before 1929, 1933, all that kind of stuff. And whenever that happened, what the government did was just keep a hands-off policy, and it just worked itself out. The government wasn't supposed to get too directly involved. It would correct itself. The economy would. Just wait it out. Well, that wasn't good enough for the American people. I told about the perspective of my great-grandpa in the last episode. When Roosevelt was president, they ate and had a job. When he wasn't, they didn't. We undersell what Roosevelt and his administration did to the U.S. economy during the course of the Great Depression, culminating during World War II. It amounted to little more than a revolution. In the past, the government was always hands-off, let the economy fix itself. Roosevelt was anything but that. Countless programs were initiated under the Roosevelt presidency. The government started building dams, American infrastructure, and Americans were being paid to do all of that building, to do these things. The government started providing welfare for the unemployed and the homeless. It started doing the job that people were no longer able to do for themselves, take care of the people. Roosevelt passed laws so that workers could unionize. That had been kind of an un-American activity prior to that time. The problem was that all of this government interference, all of this government taking care of the people, to some people, it had the faint smell of something else. It smelled a lot like communism. Now, to be sure, the struggles of the Great Depression, they had stirred up the American Communist Party. They were very active, the Communist Party. They were very active in the 30s, believing this was their opportunity to finally make some inroads like never before in America. Roosevelt didn't go as far as the communists wanted him to, but he went a lot closer to it than Americans had ever seen before that time period. Now, America is a lot of different things, and it has been a lot of different things throughout its history. It's been pioneering, it's been settled, it's been imperialistic, it's been isolationist. America has been democratic, it's been authoritarian. All of those have happened, but in all the changes and all the morphings and seasons of the American system, the one thing that it's always been and is unchanging is capitalist. Democracy ebbs and flows. Its freedoms and liberties ebb and flow, but America is always and at its root a capitalist country. So the Great Depression was a major threat to this fundamental and foundational component of what it is to be an American. To be American, truly American, is to be a capitalist. That's the American dream. It's to believe in free enterprise and individual ambition and power as opposed to a collective and government-ordered way of life. Well, the Great Depression gave cause to question capitalism. The communists and Roosevelt, they gave cause for the capitalists to really grow concern because they were looking to upend the capitalist values of American life. At least that's the way some people were perceiving it at the time. So capitalism and Americanism, as it is defined in capitalism, was under great threat in America in the 1930s. Now, communism is not only an economic system, it's also a philosophy on life. At that time, the Soviet Union, during the 1930s, the Soviet Union and the ruling Communist Party there in the Soviet Union, they believed, or at least it was spoken about, they believed and envisioned global domination. That was their ideal. That's what they wanted. That's what most people wanted during that time period. But that's what the Soviets wanted. What opponents of communism preached as far as fear-mongering and stuff like that. What few Americans knew was that the people in the Soviet Union were actually worse off than the Americans were during the Great Depression. Far worse off than America was for reasons that went even beyond the Great Depression. But communism and the Soviets were after global domination. Central to the anti-capitalist position of the communists was a belief in collectivism and atheism. Now, collectivism is a belief in the corporate good. In other words, we don't work for ourselves, we work for the whole of us, the whole of society. To put it simply, we all do our best work for a full day, but we only take home what's needed for us as pay. The rest, the extra that we make, that we contribute, the rest of that goes to the people around us so that everyone benefits in collectivism. Atheism, of course, is a belief that there's no God. Well, both of these messages of communism, collectivism and atheism, they contradicted hugely against Americans. But the potential for inroads being made by communists and Roosevelt's New Deal during the Great Depression, they stirred a small but influential segment of American Christians. They looked and they saw the path of communism being laid out before Americans to take hold of. And that meant the path to atheism, was what they ultimately feared. So it was here, more than ever before, the American Christian leaders, or a lot of American Christian leaders, became really highly anti-communist. It was an easy message for them to pick up. Now, it's important to recognize the motives here. Christian leaders weren't anti-communist because of its atheism. They truly saw that America was heading down a road that led to communism, and that meant atheism. There was a book written a few years back called One Nation Under God, How Corporate America Invented Christian America. And there's a lot of good stuff in it, good research, but the author misses this reality. Christian leaders weren't going anti-communist just because, they were going anti-communist because it was atheist. They weren't simply going out there to defend capitalism. That kind of that kind of folded into what they were doing. They were more anti-atheist than they were pro-capitalist, okay? They kind of stumbled into the pro-corporate reality of all of that is what happened. By going anti-communist, these Christian leaders, they merely had to equate the will of God to a pro-American position, and that's exactly what they did. Communism was evil because it was atheistic, not because it was anti-capitalist. It was atheistic, so it was evil. But America, according to these Christian leaders, was in the way of God, or walking in the ways of God, because it was about godly principles. A whole message and movement then slowly began to emerge as a result of this positioning by these Christian leaders. It started during the Great Depression, but then continued well after World War II. We still had to fight off communism once the war was over. America was the land of the free. It was the land of liberty. After all, wasn't that also the way God was described in the Bible? Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's liberty, according to one of the Bible verses. Which was that verse more in line with America or with the Soviet Union? With a country that believed in the power of the individual to go out and worship as he saw fit, or this economic and governing system that believed in collectivism and, worst of all, atheism? To fight communist ideology and progress, Christian leaders began to explain that to fight communism was to fight on the side of God and on the side, of course, of America, because Americans were fighting communist ideology. On this issue, Americanism and faith were one and the same thing. Well, by the time World War II had ended, though, America was now in a superpower status. Communism was still being fought, but now there was just more evidence of how God was for America and, of course, against the atheistic communism. I mean, he gave America the bomb. He gave America victory over the Nazis. I mean, God was for America as far as these Christian leaders could see. There were two great powers left in the world now, after the war, the Soviets and the U.S., and those two powers are going to end up fighting this Cold War for the next half century. One of those powers was pro-God and for the ways of God. The other wanted to refuse that God even existed. So the sides of truth and righteousness, as far as the Christian leaders were concerned, it's easy to figure out now by the end of World War II and as the Cold War starts picking up steam. Well, this realization, it picked up more and more in the immediate post-war years, post-World War II, so that soon patriotism within America was slowly ascending to a place of being synonymous with Scripture, with the Bible, with the ways of God. Being a good Christian was being a good American. It kind of became the same thing. Communism is presented as people being put in slavery to the state, whereas democracy and capitalism in America is freedom under God. That's a catchphrase. Freedom under God became this catchphrase and a slogan for activist Christian ministers, specifically this one named James Fifield. based out of California during the 40s and 50s. Now, Fifield, he developed this organization that preached against, for one, the New Deal during the 30s, but mostly against communism, and he encouraged Americans to hold to the ways of God. So this organization that he established was really easy to gain support and real attractive to business leaders and corporations. They helped to finance him to make his message go out across the land through radio and different media at that time, because that financial support was a great investment for the corporations, and it was a great benefit for this perspective of Christian America and Fifield that he was presenting. You know, these guys were happy to have the ways of capitalism linked up to the ways of God on the corporate side of the equation. They helped get Fifield and his message on over 800 radio stations across the country in the 1940s. Capitalism and business and free enterprise and the freedom of the individual, that was described as the American way of life by Fifield and other Christians like him during that time. Communism was about suppressing the individual for the benefit of the state, but America and Christianity, that was about all men being created equal. It was about rugged individuals who could make their life better with the help of God and the accessibility that a free society like America offered them. Now think about that for a moment. We've heard phrases like all men are created equal. All our life we've heard those kind of phrases. And it's a truly American phrase. I mean, Abraham Lincoln said all men are created equal. Countless presidents have said it. It's even in the Declaration of Independence noted as a God-given right. Surely, right there's evidence that God and America are on the same page, because both agree that all men are created equal, right? Here's the funny thing. Nowhere in the Bible does it say that all men are created equal. Now, there's a verse in Galatians that talks about the kingdom of God separates the difference between us, but nowhere does it say we're all created equal. In fact, common sense reality proves none of us are actually created equal. We're all unique and have different capacities and talents and skills and abilities. That's the way God made us. But most of us have somehow kind of believed and assumed that this American ideal of all men being created equal is also scriptural, and it's not. The Declaration of Independence says God made us all equal, but there's absolutely no biblical basis for that position. So that's how American ideals kind of cross over into religious ideals, and we get confused about which ideal came first, from which source. And you see how easy it happens, and that was what was happening in the post-war years. America was dominant. America was victorious. Communism was evil. They were the enemy. God was for us, so who could stand against us? And all of these verses and all of this Christian perspective begin to mingle and mix with this idea of patriotism and nationalism. And the two were slowly becoming synonymous. So this partnership between American business and capitalism, between Christian religion, really started to pick up during the post-war years. And the greatest generation who was coming home from World War II was ready for a time of hope. They're ready for something good to believe in. And America, the land that God loved, was just the ticket for them. They wanted something good to finally be happening. I mean, think about what all they had been through at this point. Well, right about then is when Billy Graham's ministry and his crusades hit the American landscape. Hundreds of thousands of people heard the gospel message at Billy Graham's crusades that he would put on. If you've read the book Unbroken, you know the true story about this guy, Louis Zamperini, who survived the Great Depression. He ran in the Olympics. He fought in the World War II. He survived a Japanese POW camp. After the war, this guy from America's greatest generation, he comes home and his life begins to collapse. I mean, think about what he's seen. He's seen more by the time he was 30 than most people do in their whole lifetime. He's seen economic hardship. He's seen the Olympics. He's seen war. He's seen prison camp. He's seen torture, and he comes home and he's supposed to just act like all of this is normal. He's supposed to pretend he doesn't, I guess have what they called shell shock back then. We call PTSD nowadays. And a lot of the guys coming home from the war at that time had stories of drama and trauma that they could all tell, that they could all relate to. And many of them, like Zamperini, they began to turn to vices like alcoholism because their life began to fall apart as they just couldn't maintain a normal hold on their life once they got back from the war. Well, then Billy Graham and his massive revival crusades comes along, and no one has seen anything like this before. It's like the World Series coming to town, but the World Series is all about God. Many of these folks from the greatest generation, like Louis Zamperini, they ended up attending those crusades, and they got saved and their life turned around at a Billy Graham revival. This was an experience for Zamperini, but it's similar for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Americans during this time period. They were finding hope, and that hope was linked to God, and God was now linked to American ideals. They were seen as one and the same by this point in American history. Billy Graham, he stayed focused on the gospel message during this time period, but in his focus, he also launched out against communism, and he used that pro-American language to do it. To be American was to be Christian. To be really Christian was to be a good and responsible American. So a sort of religious political revival hit America during the 1950s. You have to look to see it, but it's scattered throughout that decade. The phrase, "under God," was added to the Pledge of Allegiance in 1954. The Pledge of Allegiance was no longer being said as one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. That closed the pledge originally. Now it was one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. That changed. The under God part was added in the early 1950s, actually 1954. "In God We Trust" became the national motto of the United States in 1956. Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas, he explained in an official decision in 1952, an official Supreme Court decision, he said, "We are a religious people whose institutions presuppose a supreme being." That's pretty powerful stuff right there, coming from the Supreme Court Justice. President Eisenhower, he's president. Everybody liked Ike, was the saying in the 50s. He's baptized, and he even held prayer meetings at the White House during the 50s. He explained in 1954, when approving that change to the Pledge of Allegiance, that children throughout America should know about the dedication of our nation and our people to the Almighty. These are Ike's words, President Eisenhower's words. In this way, this is, again, President Eisenhower, in this way we are reaffirming the transcendence of religious faith in America's heritage and future. In this way, we shall constantly strengthen those spiritual weapons which forever will be our country's most powerful resource in peace or war. Powerful stuff coming from the president, especially if you're a Christian, listening to all of this during that time period. A National Day of Prayer was passed by Congress and signed by the President in 1952. The link between American ideals and the ways and preferences of God were linked. They were established, and during this time period, there was a stark contrast between what it was to be America and what it was to be a communist, our enemies. Those godless communists on the other side of the world. We were in a fight for good and evil, light and darkness, freedom versus oppression, liberty versus slavery. God was for one of these powers. He was against the other. That was the message that was going out. But that's only the beginning. For the Christian right to really come of age and radicalize, there would be a huge setback. There has to be a huge setback to really tighten an organization and an ideology together. And that setback would be by the generation that followed the greatest generation. That generation, the greatest generation's children, the baby boomers, would show America and American Christians what a society without God looked like, and they would help set the stage for the rise of what we know today as the religious right. And that's what we're going to look at in the next episode, which you can download once again in 2 days. Now, as we close out, I want to remind you, please go to the End of History website, leave your comments on the post regarding this episode. I'm happy to start a dialogue with anybody who has something positive to say. Follow us on Facebook, leave the positive reviews on iTunes, help spread the word about the End of History, and we will see you at the next episode.
Thanks for listening to The End of History with J.B. Shreve. Check out more episodes at iTunes and wherever you download quality podcasts. Join us online at theendofhistory.net for articles and essays from the end of history. Follow JB on Twitter at JB_Shreve. The End of History is produced by Windmill Media.